September 1944, somewhere in eastern France. 23-year-old former auto mechanic from Ohio named sat inside Sherman tank that weighed 33 tons and had armor thinner than a kitchen countertop compared to what was waiting. For him, down that road had been a tank driver for exactly 4 months before the war. He fixed at his uncle's garage in Cleveland. He could rebuild a transmission blindfolded. He knew engines the way a surgeon knows the human heart, but nothing in Cleveland had prepared him for what German intelligence had just placed directly in his path: 92 Tiger tanks, the most terrifying weapon rolling on treads in the entire Second World War. Each one weighed 56 tons, each one carried an 88 cannon that could punch through Sherman like a fist through wet cardboard from over a mile away. At that range, 75 couldn't even scratch the Tiger's front armor. The math was simple and it was brutal. One Tiger killed 4 Shermans. On average, before going down, 92 Tigers meant the potential destruction of nearly 400 American tanks and over 1,500 American lives. German High Command was betting everything on this single deployment. Stop the Third Army, buy enough time to reorganize the crumbling Western Front. On paper, 92 Tigers should have done exactly that. On paper, and thousands of men like him should have died in the fields of eastern France that September. They didn't. When the smoke cleared less than 72 hours later, fewer than 5 Tigers were still operational. The rest were burning, abandoned, captured, or blown apart, and a former auto mechanic from Cleveland played a role that military historians are still studying today. This is how it happened. To understand why Germany made this desperate gamble, you need to understand how badly things had gone wrong for them. By late summer 1944, the Allied invasion at Normandy on June 6 had cracked open Fortress Europe, but it was what happened after Normandy that truly terrified the German generals. For weeks after D-Day, the fighting in the country of Normandy had been a grinding, bloody stalemate. Allies were gaining yards, not miles. German defenders used the thick hedgerows and narrow lanes of to create killing zones that neutralized Allied numerical superiority. American casualties were staggering. Some infantry divisions suffered 100% turnover in their rifle companies within weeks. Tanks were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Then everything changed. Operation Cobra, launched on July 25, 1944, blew a hole in the German lines west of Loos, and through that hole poured the most aggressive armored force in the Allied arsenal. General George S. Third Army didn't just advance, he exploded across France. His tank columns covered distances that German planners had considered impossible. 30 m in a day snorts 50 m in a day. Towns that German commanders expected to hold for weeks fell in hours. Entire German divisions that were supposed to form defensive lines found themselves encircled before they could even dig foxholes. By mid-August, the German position in France was collapsing. The Falaise pocket trapped tens of thousands of German soldiers. Paris was liberated on August 25 and kept pushing east toward the German border itself, moving so fast that his own supply lines could barely keep up. The speed was unprecedented. Nothing in the war on any front had moved this fast. German commanders who had fought on the Eastern Front against the Soviets said his advance was faster and more disorienting than anything the Russians had ever achieved. The casualties told the story. In August alone, the German army in the West lost over 300,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. They lost thousands of tanks, guns, and vehicles. Entire units simply ceased to exist. Staff officers at German headquarters were moving pins on maps so fast that the maps became useless before they were updated. Third Army alone had captured more territory in 2 weeks than the entire Allied force had taken in the 2 months since D-Day. Something had to be done, something dramatic. Conventional defenses were failing. Infantry divisions were being overrun. Anti-tank guns were being flanked before they could fire a shot. The German generals needed a weapon that could stop armor cold, that could destroy enough Shermans to force even the most aggressive American commander to pause. They needed the Tiger, but everything was about to change because of men nobody had ever heard of. Men whose names would never appear in history books, but whose actions would determine the fate of the most powerful tanks ever built. Had enlisted the day after his 22nd birthday. In 1943, he wasn't a hero. He wasn't even particularly brave by his own admission. He was a mechanic who understood machines the way some people understand music intuitively, completely at a level That went beyond technical knowledge into something almost like instinct. In basic training, his instructors noticed that could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. He could tell you what was wrong with a tank engine from 50 feet away just by listening to it idle. When he was assigned to the 3rd Army's tank crews, his commanding officer put him as a driver, not because was the best driver, but because having someone who understood the Sherman's mechanical limits meant the tank could be pushed harder, faster, longer without breaking down, had survived his first combat. Normandy, he'd seen Tigers for the first time near in early August when the Germans launched their desperate counterattack. He watched from 800 wide as a single Tiger destroyed 3 Shermans from his company in less than 2 minutes. The shells went through the Shermans like they weren't even there. Crews burned alive. His tank survived only because his commander ordered a retreat behind a hedgerow before the Tiger could traverse its turret to their position. That night couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the Tiger, not with fear, though there was plenty of that, but with a mechanic's curiosity. He'd seen how the Tiger moved, how slowly it traversed, how long it took to reposition, how the engine sounded when it shifted gears, and something clicked in his mind, in the same way a diagnosis clicked when he heard a bad valve lifter. Back in Cleveland, the Tiger was powerful, yes, but it was also mechanical nightmare. Could hear it in the engine note, could see it in how the tracks handled terrain, could feel it in the way the massive turret struggled to track targets. Started talking to other tank crews. He started collecting information. How fast could a Tiger traverse its turret? About 60 seconds. For a full rotation compared to 15 seconds for a Sherman. How quickly could it accelerate? Barely at all. The Tiger went from 0 to top speed like a freight train, slow and ponderous. What happened when a Tiger tried to move on soft ground? It sank. Its ground pressure was enormous despite wide tracks. Where was the armor weakest? The sides were about 80 less than half the frontal armor. The rear was even thinner. The belly was vulnerable to mines. Wrote all this down in a small notebook he carried in his coveralls. His tank commander, a lieutenant from Virginia named James, noticed what was doing. Instead of telling him to stop, started adding his own observations. Then other crew commanders joined in. Within days, notebook had become an unofficial tactical manual, a collection of practical knowledge about Tiger weaknesses compiled by men who had faced them in combat. When this information reached Captain Robert Hayes, who commanded their tank company, Hayes didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss it. He took his notebook directly to battalion command, and battalion command took it to division, and division took it to 3rd Army headquarters, because what had done without any formal training and military tactics was essentially confirm what had been preaching for months. The Tiger could be beaten not by building a better tank, not by matching it gun for gun and armor for armor, but by understanding its mechanical weaknesses and exploiting them ruthlessly. The idea that a mechanic's observations could influence armored tactics was considered ridiculous by some staff officers. These were West Point graduates, professional soldiers who had studied armored warfare for years, and here was a former mechanic telling them how to fight Tigers. Some officers wanted to dismiss it entirely. One colonel reportedly said that if they needed a grease monkey to tell them how to fight, they might as well surrender now, but was different, understood something that many career officers did not. War is not won by credentials, it is won by knowledge applied at the right moment, hence knowledge of machines combined with his direct combat experience against Tigers represented exactly the kind of practical intelligence that wins battles. Had his staff compile observations alongside their own intelligence reports, the result was a set of tactical guidelines that would be distributed to every tank unit in the 3rd Army. Core insight was devastatingly simple. Stop thinking of the Tiger as an invincible super weapon. Start thinking of it as a machine, and every machine has weaknesses. Every machine breaks down. Every machine has limits. The Tiger's limits were speed, fuel consumption, mechanical reliability, and turret traverse rate. A Sherman crew that understood these limits and fought accordingly could survive. A Sherman company that coordinated its attacks to exploit these limits could win. Didn't know it then, but his notebook would help save lives in the battle that was coming, because German intelligence had made their decision. 92 Tigers were being assembled, fueled, armed, and positioned directly across line of advance. It was the largest single deployment of Tiger tanks against American forces in the entire war. The Germans called it Operation Iron Hammer. The plan was straightforward. Position the Tigers in three defensive lines across the most likely avenues of American advance. First line would engage and destroy the leading American armor. Second line would catch any units that broke through. Third line would serve as a mobile reserve to counterattack any flanking attempts. Each line was supported by infantry, anti-tank guns, and what little artillery the Germans could still concentrate on. Paper, it was a perfect defensive deployment. Three walls of the most powerful tanks in the world each, capable of destroying American Shermans at ranges where the Shermans couldn't fire back effectively. German planners estimated it would take forces at least 2 weeks to break through if they could break through at all. 2 weeks would give Germany time to rush reinforcements from other sectors, time to fortify the approaches to the time to organize the kind of deep defensive belt that had held the Allies in Normandy for months. That was the plan. What actually happened bore no resemblance to any plan. Reconnaissance units detected unusual German armored activity 3 days before the main engagement. Scout planes reported large numbers of heavy tanks moving into concealed positions. Signal intelligence intercepted communications referencing Tiger units being redeployed from other sectors. And ground scouts, including a team that's company supported, identified Tiger track marks on roads leading to defensive positions. The initial deployment confirmed what they had discovered. American scouts counted at least 40 Tigers in forward positions, with reports of more arriving. This was not a routine defensive screen. This was a massive concentration of heavy armor, the largest Tiger deployment any American unit had ever faced. When the reports reached headquarters, staff officers recommended caution, slow the advance, bring up additional forces. Plan a set-piece assault with overwhelming numerical superiority. Standard doctrine against fortified armor rejected every recommendation. His response became legendary among his staff. He reportedly said that stopping was exactly what the Germans wanted. Every hour he paused was an hour the Tigers spent getting better positioned, better supplied, better prepared. The Tigers were strongest when they were sitting still, hauled down in prepared positions with clear fields of fire. So the last thing he intended to do was give them time to sit still. Instead, did something that his own officers initially thought was insane. He accelerated the advance. He split his forces into multiple columns approaching from different directions. He requested every available fighter-bomber squadron for close air support. He moved his artillery forward to positions that were dangerously close to the expected engagement zone, and he sent orders down to every tank company in the Third Army, including the orders were clear: do not stop when you encounter Tigers, do not engage in long-range duels, close the distance, use terrain, call in artillery, call in air support, attack the flanks, keep moving. Always keep moving. Read those orders sitting on the engine deck of his Sherman on a cool September evening. He looked at his notebook, and oil-stained, filled with observations about Tiger weaknesses. Tomorrow he would find out if those observations were right. Tomorrow 92 Tigers would try to stop Third Army, but what neither nor anyone else in the Third Army knew was that the next 72 hours would become one of the most devastating defeats in the history of armored warfare. Not for the Americans, for the Tigers, and the battle hadn't even started yet. In Part 2 we will see what happened when tactics met Germany's superweapon, how a former odd mechanic's instincts saved his crew in the first terrifying minutes of contact. How 92 Tigers were systematically hunted, flanked, and destroyed by an army that refused to play by the rules the Germans expected, and why the first 6 hours of battle turned into the worst nightmare German tank crews had ever experienced. The Tigers were waiting, was coming, and nothing would ever be the same. In Part 1, a former auto mechanic named compiled a notebook of Tiger tank weaknesses that reached headquarters. 92 Tigers were positioned across line of advance in the largest heavy armor deployment against American forces. The entire war's response was to accelerate, not retreat. His orders went out to every tank company: close the distance, attack the flanks, never stop moving. But convincing tank crews who had watched Tigers destroy Shermans like tin cans to charge toward those same Tigers was another matter entirely, because the men who would execute orders had a problem that no tactical manual could solve. They were terrified, and that terror was about to collide with the biggest institutional obstacle had ever faced: a man who believed that mechanics should fix engines, not write tactics. And this is where everything got worse. Colonel Harold commanded the armored regiment that included company, was Old Army, West Point class Of 1928, he had served in North Africa, survived pass, fought through Sicily and landed in Normandy on D-Day +3. He had earned every medal on his chest through blood and steel, and he had absolutely zero patience for a corporal who thought he knew more about fighting tanks than officers who had been doing it for 2 years. When Captain Hayes brought's notebook observations up the chain's reaction was immediate and volcanic. He called Hayes into his command post on the evening before the expected engagement and made his position perfectly clear. "Captain, are you telling me that a tank driver, a mechanic, is advising my regiment on armored tactics against Tiger tanks?" Hayes tried to explain the observations were sound, they matched zone tactical guidelines, the information about turret traverse rates, fuel consumption, mechanical vulnerabilities. It was practical intelligence gathered from direct combat experience. Cut him off. "I've been fighting German armor since I lost 14 tanks at. I know what Tigers can do, and what Tigers can do is kill Shermans. The answer to Tigers is not some grease monkey's notebook. The answer is concentration of force, proper reconnaissance, and disciplined fire and maneuver, not whatever cowboy nonsense. His headquarters is cooking up. Subjection wasn't irrational. His experience at Pass in February 1943 had been catastrophic. American forces had attacked German positions without coordination and had been slaughtered. Had learned a brutal lesson there. You don't rush into a fight against superior armor. You plan carefully. You concentrate your forces. You attack with overwhelming numbers at a single point. What was ordering splitting forces into multiple columns, accelerating toward the strongest concentration of Tigers ever assembled. Looked too exactly like the kind of reckless aggression that had gotten hundreds of Americans killed at. He ordered Hayes to shove's observations. Standard doctrine would be followed. The regiment would advance in concentrated formation, engage Tigers at range, and rely on numerical superiority. This was exactly the kind of fight Tigers were designed to win, and was about to order his men into it. Heard about the colonel's decision from lieutenant that same evening, was frustrated. He'd seen what Tigers could do at. He knew that a concentrated formation advancing across open ground against prepared Tiger positions was a death sentence for the leading tanks, but was a lieutenant, was a colonel. The chain of command existed for a reason. Didn't care about the chain of command. He cared about the men in his tank, the men in his company, the men who would die tomorrow morning if they drove straight at 92 Tigers in a neat formation that the German gunners would pick apart like target practice. So did something that could have gotten him court-martialed. He went over his head, but he didn't go alone. Because he'd found an unexpected ally, Major Thomas was the regiment's operations officer. The S3 was responsible for planning the regiment's tactical movements, and he had been quietly studying the same intelligence that had produced anti-Tiger guidelines. Was 31 years old, a former engineering student from MIT who had been commissioned through OCS in 1942. He understood machines, he understood systems, and he understood that his plan would get men killed for no strategic gain. Had read his notebook not because brought it to him, but because Captain Hayes had quietly slipped it onto his desk 3 days earlier with a note that said simply, "The mechanic sees what we're missing." Had his observations against intelligence reports. The turret traverse rate was accurate, the fuel consumption data matched captured German logistics documents, the mechanical reliability estimates aligned with reports from units that had recovered disabled Tigers. When came to his tent that night, was already working on an alternative plan, not to replace his orders entirely, but to modify them enough to give the regiment a fighting chance. His plan kept the basic structure of his advance but added critical elements. Advanced scouts would identify Tiger positions before the main force committed. Artillery would be pre-registered on likely Tiger positions and ready to fire within 90 seconds of contact. Tank destroyers would be positioned on the flanks, not in the main column, ready to maneuver for side shots the moment Tigers revealed themselves, and crucially, no single company would advance alone across open ground. If one company drew fire, adjacent companies would immediately flank. The problem was that implementing this plan required his approval, and had made his position clear, made a decision that risked his career. He contacted 3rd Army headquarters directly, bypassing, and requested that a representative from staff be present for the morning briefing. The request was granted. Lieutenant Colonel David, one of his most trusted tactical advisors, would attend. The next morning, September 12th, the briefing was tense. Presented his plan, concentrated advance, masked Armor engaged Tigers at range with numerical superiority, standard doctrine. When finished spoke, he didn't criticize directly. Instead, he laid out Third Army intelligence on the German deployment, 3 lines of Tigers prepared. Positions with pre-registered kill zones, infantry support with anti-tank weapons covering the gaps between Tiger. Positions, estimated time to breach the first line under plan 8 to 12. Hours, estimated American tank losses during that breach, 40 to 60% of the leading battalion. The room went silent, his face was stone. Continued, Under's preferred approach, multiple axes of advance with combined arms coordination. The estimated breach time dropped to 4 to 6 hours. Estimated losses dropped to 15 to 25%, still heavy, still painful, but survivable. Argued back, those estimates assume perfect coordination in combat. Coordination breaks down, radios fail, smoke obscures targets, men panic. Concentrated force gives us mass. Mass wins battles, nodded, mass wins battles when the enemy is dispersed, when the enemy is concentrated in prepared positions with the most powerful tank gun in the world. Mass gives them environment. General's orders are clear. Colonel, multiple axes, combined arms, speed. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order from Third Army Command, delivered politely but unmistakably. Had no choice. He accepted the modified plan, but he made one thing clear to afterward: if this goes wrong, Major, it's your career and that mechanic's stripes on the line, not mine. Didn't blink. He had 16 hours to prepare the regiment for the largest Tiger engagement in American military history, and the clock was already running. The morning of September 13, 1944 broke gray and cool. With a low fog sitting in the valleys of eastern France, the fog was a gift. It reduced visibility to less than 500 wide, which meant the Tigers' greatest advantage, their ability to kill at extreme range, was temporarily neutralized. Sat in his driver's seat, engine idling, watching the fog swirl around the hull of his Sherman. Lieutenant was in the turret, scanning with binoculars that were useless in the murk. The radio crackled with position reports from scout units ahead. First contact came at 6:47. A scout team reported Tiger positions along approximately 1,200 wide. Ahead, at least 8 Tigers visible, probably more behind the ridge. They were hauled down, only their turrets exposed above the terrain. Guns pointed directly down the main approach road. Exactly where German intelligence had predicted American armor would come. Under's original plan, the regiment would have advanced straight down that road. The first company to crest the rise would have been visible to 8 Tiger guns simultaneously. At 1,200, the Tigers would have had roughly 45 seconds of unobstructed firing before the Shermans could close to effective range. 8 Tigers firing every 8 seconds meant approximately 45 rounds of 88 fire hitting the lead company before they could shoot back. The math was annihilating. Instead's plan went into effect. The lead company stopped short of the ridge. Artillery coordinates were transmitted. Within 3 minutes, 105 shells began falling on the Tiger positions, not to destroy them. The shells couldn't penetrate Tiger armor from above at that angle, but the explosions forced Tiger crews to button up closing hatches, losing the external visibility they needed to aim accurately at long range. Simultaneously, company and 2 others peeled off the main road, moving through the fog along secondary tracks that the scouts had identified during the night. Pushed his Sherman through a muddy farm lane, barely wide enough for the tank branches scraping the whole visibility down to 200 wide. His heart was hammering somewhere ahead, and to his right the Tigers were sitting on that ridge, their guns covering the main road, not expecting anything from this direction. At 7:12, company emerged from a tree line 600 to the left flank of the Tiger position. 600 at that range, the Tigers' side armor of 80 was vulnerable to the Sherman's 75 gun. More importantly, the Tigers' turrets were facing the wrong direction, pointed down the main road where artillery was still falling. Gave the order to fire. 5 Shermans from company opened up simultaneously on the exposed flanks of the Tiger positions. Felt his tank rock with the recoil. Through his periscope, he saw a flash against the side of the nearest Tiger, a hit, then another. The Tiger's turret began to traverse toward them, that slow grinding rotation that had timed so many times in his notebook. 60 seconds for a full traverse. They had 60 seconds. In those 60 seconds, company fired 23 rounds. 4 Tigers were hit from the side. 2 began to smoke. 1 exploded as ammunition cooked off inside. The 4th Tiger's track was shattered, immobilizing it. Remaining Tigers on the line were now caught between artillery from the front and tank fire from the flank. Their carefully prepared kill zone had become a trap, and they were inside it. At the same moment, P-47 Thunderbolts arrived overhead. The fog had lifted. Enough for air operations, and requested air support descended on the German positions with rockets and 500 bombs. Two more Tigers were hit from above. One took a direct rocket hit to the engine deck and burst into flame. The crew bilayed out and ran, tank destroyers that had circled even wider. Then's company now appeared on the Tiger's right flank, M18 Hellcats fast and lightly armored, but mounting 76mm guns that could penetrate Tiger's sidearm at combat range. They fired and displaced, never staying in one position long enough for the Tigers to engage them. Within 90 minutes of first contact, 11 of the estimated 15 Tigers in the first defensive line were destroyed, immobilized, or abandoned. American losses were 4 Shermans destroyed and 2 damaged. The ratio that was supposed to be 4 Shermans per Tiger had been almost reversed. The first line was broken, but this was only the first line. Behind it, at least 60 more Tigers waited in the second and third defensive positions, and the Germans had been watching. They had seen their first line collapse in minutes instead of holding. For days, they were already adapting, repositioning, closing the gaps that's flanking maneuver had exploited. Colonel, watching the first engagement from his command, said nothing for a long time. Then he picked up the radio and called. The mechanic's information was correct. About the traverse rate, what else does he know about their second line? It was the closest thing to an apology would ever receive, and it was enough. Headquarters received the report within the hour. 11 Tigers destroyed in 90 minutes with minimal American losses. The response from 3rd Army was a single sentence that embodied everything believed about warfare. Do not stop. Repeat, do not stop. The regiment pushed forward toward the 2nd Tiger line, but the Germans had learned. They had repositioned their Tigers to cover multiple approaches, not just the main road. They had pulled infantry closer to the tank positions to prevent flanking maneuvers. They had dispersed their Tigers more widely to reduce the effectiveness of artillery concentrations. The second line would be harder, and something else was happening that nobody on the American side knew about yet. A German signals unit had intercepted fragments of American radio traffic during the first engagement. They had heard the coordination between tanks, artillery, and air support. They had heard references to Tiger weaknesses, and they had transmitted report to German high command that would change how the remaining Tigers fought. The Germans were adapting. The easy victories were over. Notebook had helped break the first line, but 60 Tigers remained in there. Crews were no longer sitting in prepared positions, waiting for Americans to come to them. They were moving, repositioning, setting up ambushes in locations the Americans hadn't scouted, hiding towns and forests where air support was useless and artillery was dangerous to use. The Tiger crews had received new orders from German command. Do not fight defensively, do not hold positions, hunt the Shermans, use the towns, use the forests, use the night. Turn the Tigers' weaknesses into strengths by fighting at close range, where American coordination couldn't save them. In Part 1, figured out how to fight Tigers. In Part 2, his ideas helped shatter the first defensive line, but in Part 3, the Tigers would stop being the hunted and start being the hunters. The Germans were coming not in defensive lines anymore, in ambush teams of 2 and 3, hiding in every village and between, and the rules of the game had changed completely, and the real war was just beginning. A former auto mechanic named wrote a notebook about Tiger tank weaknesses. That notebook helped reshape 3rd Army tactics. In the first engagements, forces shattered the first German defensive line, destroying 11 Tigers in 90 minutes with minimal losses, the ratio that was supposed to favor Tigers had been reversed. But as Part 2 ended, German signals intelligence had intercepted American radio traffic. They heard the coordination, they heard references to Tiger vulnerabilities, and they issued new orders to their remaining crews: stop defending, start hunting. 60 Tigers changed from stationary fortresses into mobile ambush predators, hiding in villages and forests where American air support was blind and artillery was dangerous. The easy part was over. The statistics that followed proved it. In the next 36 hours, American tank losses tripled compared to the first engagement. 8 Shermans were destroyed in a single afternoon by just 3 Tigers operating in ambush teams inside a French village. And now, this was no longer an experiment in tactics. This was a fight for survival on both sides. German command reacted to the destruction of their first defensive line with a speed that surprised American intelligence. Within hours of receiving the signals, intercept General Fritz, commanding the remnants of Panzer Lehr Division and coordinating Tiger operations in the sector, convened an emergency meeting with his surviving Tiger Company commanders. Was no fool, he had commanded tanks in North Africa under. He had fought the British, the Americans, and he understood that clinging to doctrine, when doctrine was failing, meant death. The intercepted radio traffic told Bayer line exactly what the Americans were doing: combined arms coordination, flanking maneuvers against Tiger side armor, artillery suppression to force crews to button up, airstrikes on exposed positions. Every advantage the Tiger possessed in a prepared defensive position was being systematically neutralized. Orders were radical by German standards: abandon the remaining two defensive lines, disperse the Tigers into teams of 2 or 3, move them into villages, forests, and urban areas where American air power could not operate effectively, and where artillery risked killing French civilians and destroying infrastructure the Americans themselves needed. Fight at close range, ambush, and withdraw. Never stay in one position longer than 30 minutes. Use the Tiger's massive gun not at long range where flanking was possible, but at point-blank range inside towns where a single shot down a narrow street could destroy multiple vehicles. It was the opposite of everything Tiger crews had been trained to do, but it was brilliant. Within 12 hours, the remaining 60 operational Tigers had vanished from their defensive positions. American scouts reported the second and third lines abandoned. For a brief moment, American commanders thought the Germans were retreating. They were wrong. The first ambush came at the village of. A column of 6 Shermans from Charlie Company advanced through the village's main street. Standard procedure: infantry screening ahead, tanks following in file. The lid Sherman reached the village square. A Tiger was hidden inside a partially collapsed barn, its gun barrel protruding just 3 past the rubble. Range was 80 yards. At 80 yards, the 88mm round went through the front armor of the lead Sherman, through the engine compartment and out the back plate. The Sherman behind it took a round through the turret before the crew even identified where the shot came from. The Tiger reversed out of the barn, crushing the rear wall, and disappeared down an alley before American tank destroyers could respond. 2 Shermans destroyed, 0 damage to the Tiger. Time elapsed 45 seconds. This was the new war. 3 more ambushes followed that afternoon. A Tiger hidden behind a farmhouse, 2 Tigers positioned at opposite ends of a crossroads, creating a crossfire. A single Tiger concealed in a sunken lane that fired into the side of a passing column and then into woods. By evening, 8 American tanks were destroyed and 3 damaged. No Tigers lost. The combined arms approach that had worked so brilliantly against the first defensive line was useless in close terrain where every advantage belonged to the ambusher. But this was not the only problem facing forces inside Third Army. A crisis was developing that threatened to undo everything observations had helped achieve. The success of the first engagement had created overconfidence. Some company commanders, having seen Tigers destroyed relatively easily in the first battle, began treating all Tiger encounters as simple tactical problems. They stopped calling for artillery support. They stopped waiting for air cover. They advanced aggressively into terrain they hadn't scouted, assuming that speed and flanking would solve every engagement. It didn't. At the ambush at killed 3 men from his own battalion. One of them was Corporal James Dunning's loader, who had been transferred to another crew just 2 days earlier to replace a wounded man. Found out over the radio. He sat in his driver's seat and didn't speak for an hour. Colonel, who had initially opposed the modified tactics, now used the mounting casualties to push back against approach entirely. He sent a report to division headquarters, arguing that the dispersed Tiger tactics made combined arms coordination impossible, and that the regiment should halt, consolidate, and wait for reinforcements before continuing the advance. The report included the casualty figures from the ambushes: 8 tanks, 23 killed, 14 wounded in a single afternoon. Division forwarded the report to 3rd Army. For 12 hours there was silence from headquarters, and every man in the regiment waited, not knowing whether the advance would continue or whether they would dig and face weeks of grinding attrition against Tigers that appeared and vanished like ghosts. Some officers privately blamed Notebook for creating the overconfidence that led to the ambush losses. If the first engagement hadn't gone so well, would have been more cautious. If's plan hadn't worked so Perfectly, commanders wouldn't have become reckless. The mechanics' observations had helped win the first battle, and some argued had contributed to losing the second. Himself wondered if they were right. 3 men were dead. James Dunning was dead, and the Tigers were still out there, invisible, waiting. But then a message arrived that changed everything. Himself sent the response, not through staff channels, directly over the command net in language that every radio operator in the regiment could hear. The message was vintage Patton, blunt, profane, and absolutely clear. Tigers hiding in villages means tigers have abandoned the open ground. They gave up their defensive lines. They are reacting to us. We do not stop because the enemy adapts. We adapt faster. New orders follow. The new orders arrived within the hour, and they represented a tactical evolution that would become a case study for the next 80 years. Staff had analyzed the ambush pattern in real time. Tigers in villages needed narrow streets and buildings for concealment. They operated in pairs or threes. They fired, and weakness was movement. A tiger revering through a village was slow, loud, and visible. It couldn't hide once it fired, and it couldn't reposition faster than radio could transmit its location. New plan was simple and devastating. Every infantry squad advancing through a village would carry smoke grenades and SCR 536 handheld radios. Upon Tiger contact, infantry would immediately pop smoke to obscure the Tiger sight line and radio the exact position. Tank destroyers would not enter the village. They would be prepositioned at every exit road waiting. Artillery would fire white phosphorus rounds to mark the Tiger's location from above, and P-47s would orbit overhead, not to bomb the village, but to track any Tiger attempting to withdraw and hit it once it reached open ground. The Americans were turning every village into a trap. If a Tiger fired from inside a town, it revealed itself. Smoke cut its vision. Tank destroyers blocked its escape routes. Aircraft tracked it from above. The ambush predator became the ambush prey. September 15th, the village of population 400, 3 streets, 1 church, 2 bridges, American intelligence had identified probable Tiger positions based on track marks and a report from a French farmer who had watched 2 Tigers drive into barns on the east side of the village the previous night. Major personally planned the engagement. Infantry from Baker Company entered the village from the west at 5:30, moving in small teams along building walls, checking corners, marking potential Tiger hiding positions with chalk. Tank destroyers from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion positioned at every road leading out of the village. 4 vehicles, 4 exits, no escape. Artillery battery registered on the village square and eastern approaches. P-47s on standby at 8,000. Sherman and 3 others waited 400 wide west of the village. They were bait. Their job was to advance slowly along the main road, presenting exactly the kind of target that Tiger ambush crews couldn't resist. A column of Shermans approaching in file, the same formation that had been destroyed at Drove. His hands were steady, but his mouth was dry. He was the first tank in the column, the first target. If a Tiger fired from inside the village, his Sherman would be the one it hit. Sat above him in the turret, scanning windows and rooftops through his periscope. Nobody spoke. At 6:14, Sherman reached the first buildings. The street narrowed, walls rose on both sides, exactly the killing ground a Tiger would choose. At 6:17, the Tiger fired round past 3 feet above his turret, close enough that the shock wave cracked his periscope. The Tiger was in a barn 120 yards ahead, its barrel visible through a gap in the doors. It had aimed for the turret and missed high, an 88 round that missed high by 3, was alive by 36 in, screamed into the radio. Tiger barn, east side, 120 yards, Main Street. Everything happened simultaneously. Smoke grenades flew from infantry positions on both sides of the street. Within seconds, white smoke billowed across the road, cutting the Tiger's line of sight. The Tiger fired again, blind the round, smashing through the wall of a house to his left and exiting through the roof, threw the Sherman into reverse and backed out of the kill zone at full speed, tracks grinding on cobblestones. Artillery opened up, not on the barn, on the roads east of the village. White phosphorus rounds burst in brilliant white clouds, marking every exit route. The P-47s overhead banked hard, pilots looking for movement. Inside the barn, the Tiger crew made their decision. They couldn't see, they couldn't stay, they had to move. Tiger's engine roared. It crashed through the barn's rear wall and turned onto a side street heading east toward the nearest bridge. It never reached the bridge. A tank destroyer from the 74th was positioned 200 wide from the bridge, hull down behind a stone wall. The Tiger Came around a corner at 12, turret still facing west toward the smoke. Tank destroyer fired twice. Both rounds hit the Tiger's side armor at 200 wide. The first penetrated. The second detonated ammunition inside. The hull, the Tiger erupted. The second Tiger in the village tried to withdraw. North, a P-47 pilot tracked it from overhead, radioing its position to second tank destroyer covering the northern road. The Tiger emerged from between two houses into a narrow lane. The tank destroyer fired from 300 wide. First round hit the front drive sprocket, immobilizing the Tiger. The crew bilayed out. Infantry captured 3 of the 4 crew members within minutes. 2 Tigers engaged, 2 Tigers destroyed or captured. 0 American tanks lost, 0 American fatalities. Became the template. Within 24 hours, every company in the regiment had received the new tactical procedures. Within 48 hours, the approach spread across the entire 3rd Army sector. Results were staggering. In the 3 days before the village trap tactic was implemented, Tiger ambushes had destroyed 14 American tanks and killed 37 men. In the 3 days after, American forces engaged and destroyed 19 Tigers while losing only 5 Shermans. The kill ratio had shifted from nearly 3-1 in the Tigers' favor during the ambush phase to almost 4-1 in American favor. News of the village trap spread through the 3rd Army like electricity. Tank crews who had been terrified of entering villages now actively sought Tiger contacts, knowing the system worked. Morale surged. Commanders who had resisted its aggressive approach saw the numbers and converted. Colonel, who had argued for halting the advance, quietly stopped sending reports to division recommending consolidation. German commanders noticed the shift immediately. Reports from this period captured after the war revealed growing desperation. His dispersal tactic had worked for barely 48 hours before the Americans adapted. Tiger losses accelerated. Crews were increasingly reluctant to engage, knowing that firing their gun was essentially signing their own death warrant if they were inside a village. Some crews abandoned their Tigers without firing at all, preferring capture to the near certainty of destruction. By September 18, 5 days after the first engagement, 67 of the original 92 Tigers were destroyed, captured, abandoned, or immobilized. 25 remained nominally operational, but fuel shortages had reduced that number to perhaps 15 that could actually move and fight. German High Command's Hammer operation had not just failed, it had become a catastrophe. The strategic impact extended far beyond one regiment or one sector. Intelligence reports on anti-Tiger tactics were distributed to every Allied army in the European theater. British forces adopted modified versions within weeks. The psychological effect on German armored forces was profound. Tiger crews who had entered battle believing themselves invulnerable now understood they were priority targets in a sophisticated killing system. German war production records show that by October 1944, requests from field commanders for Tiger replacements dropped sharply, not because Tigers weren't needed but because commanders had concluded that committing Tigers against forces was simply feeding expensive machines into a destruction system. The resources were better spent on defensive fortifications and infantry weapons. The myth of the invincible Tiger, the weapon that had terrorized Allied armies since North Africa, was dying in the fields and villages of eastern France, received a Bronze Star for his role. Auburn engagement, Major was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel. Captain Hayes received a Silver Star for leading the company through 4 Tiger engagements without a single fatality. Even Colonel, who had initially opposed everything, received a commendation for the regiment's overall performance. But the war was not over. Far from it, the Tigers that remained were being pulled back toward the German border, and behind that border something was being planned that would dwarf Operation Iron Hammer, something that would throw 250,000 German soldiers and the last reserves of German armor against the Allies in a final desperate gamble. The date would become infamous: December 16, 1944. The place, the forest, the Battle of the Bulge, and would be there in his Sherman with his notebook facing not 92 Tigers but an entire German panzer army. But what happened between September and December, the 3 months that military records barely mention, contains a chapter that few people know, a chapter about a mechanic who became something more than a mechanic, and a lesson about what happens when the man who helped win the battle becomes the man they blame when the next battle starts differently. That story, the final chapter, is what Part 4 is about, and it begins with Letter wrote home to Cleveland on November 3, 1944, a letter that his family kept secret for over 50 years. A former auto mechanic from Cleveland named wrote observations about Tiger tank weaknesses in a small notebook. That notebook helped reshape How's Third Army fought the most feared weapon in the German arsenal. In Part 1's insights reached Third Army headquarters and confirms own anti-Tiger doctrine. In Part 2, those tactics shattered the first German defensive line, destroying 11 Tigers. 90 minutes. In Part 3, when the Germans adapted by turning Tigers ambush predators hiding in villages, forces adapted faster, creating a village trap system that turned every town into a killing ground for Tigers. Of the 92 Tigers committed to Operation Iron Hammer, fewer than 5 survived the 72-hour battle, but the question that Part 3 left unanswered is the one that matters most. What happened to the mechanic who helped kill the myth of the invincible Tiger? The answer has a twist that nobody expected, because success in war sometimes carries a price that no metal can repay, and its price came due 3 months later in the frozen forests of the letter wrote home on November 3, 1944, the letter his family kept secret for over 50 years was addressed to his mother, Helen, at their house on East 71st Street in Cleveland. It was 4 pages long, written in pencil on U.S. Army stationery, and it said things that had never told anyone in his unit. He wrote about the men he had watched die, not in tactical terms, not in the clinical language of reports. He wrote about the sound a man makes when he's burning alive inside Sherman tank. He wrote about Corporal James Dunning, his former loader who had been killed at Montclair in a Tiger ambush. He wrote about a French girl, maybe 10 years old, who had been killed by a stray 88 round that passed through a Sherman and into the house behind it. He wrote that he could not sleep without seeing their faces, and that the only thing that kept him functioning was the work, the engines, the tanks, the mechanical problems that had logical solutions, unlike the problems inside his head that had no solutions at all. Didn't know the term. Nobody in 1944 did, but what was describing in that letter was what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. The mechanic who understood machines better than anyone in his regiment was discovering that the human machine was the one thing he couldn't diagnose or repair. Despite this, kept fighting. His reputation had grown after the Tiger engagements in September. Third Army intelligence had formalized his observations into a technical bulletin distributed to every armored unit in the European theater. Was promoted to sergeant. He was invited to brief new tank crews arriving as replacements on Tiger identification and weaknesses. The mechanic from Cleveland had become an unofficial instructor in armored warfare. Lieutenant Colonel, who had been promoted after the Tiger battles, kept close to the planning process. Whenever the regiment expected to encounter heavy German armor, consulted about mechanical vulnerabilities to assessment and tactical positioning. It was an extraordinary role for an enlisted man, and it generated resentment among some officers who felt that a sergeant with no formal military education had no business influencing tactical decisions. Colonel, to his credit, had changed his opinion entirely. In a letter to division headquarters in October 1944, wrote that Sergeant possessed an intuitive understanding of armored combat that he had not encountered in 20 years of service. He recommended for officer candidate school, declined. He told he wasn't an officer, he was a mechanic. He just wanted to fix things that were broken. Then December came, the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, 250,000 German soldiers with over 400 tanks and assault guns smashed through thinly held American lines in the forested hills of Belgium and Luxembourg. His regiment was rushed north to help contain the breakthrough. The conditions were nightmarish: sub-zero temperatures, snow and ice that made roads impassable, fog that grounded Allied aircraft for days, eliminating the air support that had been so critical to the anti-Tiger tactics. In September, Sherman threw a track on an icy road near. On December 22, while he was outside the tank in freezing darkness trying to repair the track, a German artillery barrage struck the road. Shrapnel from an airburst round hit in the left shoulder and back, dragged him behind the tank and applied field dressings until medics arrived. Survived. He was evacuated to a field hospital and then to England. He would spend 3 months recovering. The shrapnel in his back could not be fully removed. He was given a medical discharge in March 1945, 2 months before the war in Europe ended. He received the Purple Heart to add to His Bronze Star, he was 24 years old. He went home to Cleveland. Never returned to his uncle's garage. The shoulder injury limited his range of motion, making it difficult to work under cars. He took a job as a quality inspector at a Ford plant in Brook Park, checking engines on the assembly line. It was steady work. It used his ear for machines. That same instinct that had let him diagnose a tiger's weaknesses by listening to its engine. He married a woman named in 1947. They had 3 children. He never talked about the war, but his real legacy was not in Cleveland. It was in the doctrine, manuals, and war colleges of a dozen nations, and the influence of what and men like him contributed to armored warfare extended far beyond 1944. The combined arms anti-tactics that Third Army perfected against the Tigers in September 1944 became the foundation of American armored doctrine for the next 8 decades. The principle was simple but revolutionary at the time. No single weapon system wins battles. Coordinated systems win battles. A tank alone is vulnerable. A tank supported by artillery, air power infantry, and specialized anti-vehicles is part of a killing system that can defeat any individual weapon, no matter how powerful. This principle was in U.S. Army Field Manual 1733, published in 1946, which explicitly referenced the Tiger engagements as case studies. Combined arms operations against heavy armor. The manual was updated for the Korean War, where American forces used nearly identical tactics against North Korean T-34 tanks, coordinating tanks with artillery and close air support to achieve kill ratios that echoed the September 1944 battles. In Vietnam, the combined arms approach evolved to include helicopter gunships and precision artillery, but the underlying principle remained the same. No single system fights alone. Everything coordinates, everything attacks simultaneously. The enemy cannot respond to 5 threats at once. During the Gulf War in 1991, American M1 tanks faced Iraqi T-72s in conditions remarkably similar to the open terrain of France in 1944. The Iraqis, like the German Tiger crews, had superior defensive positions and expected tank battles. Americans channeling's doctrine, use speed flanking maneuvers, air supremacy, and combined arms coordination to destroy over 3,000 Iraqi armored vehicles in 100 hours while losing fewer than 50 tanks. The kill ratio was almost incomprehensible, and the tactical DNA could be traced directly back to the fields of eastern France 50 years earlier. NATO doctrine during the Cold War was built around the assumption that Soviet heavy armor would pour through the Fula Gap into West Germany in numbers that would dwarf the Tiger deployment of 1944. The response plan, called Battle Doctrine, was essentially 5 principles scaled up to a continental level: combined arms, multiple axes of attack, deep strikes against supply lines, relentless tempo, never let the enemy fight the battle they planned for. Over 40 nations adopted variations of this doctrine, from West Point to taught the Tiger engagements as textbook examples of how tactics defeat technology. The total impact is impossible to quantify precisely, but military historians estimate that the combined arms revolution that crystallized in 1944 has influenced the training of over 12 million soldiers across the Western Alliance in the 8 decades since. The principles observed in his oil-stained notebook became the grammar of modern armored warfare, but the biggest lesson from story is not about tanks or tactics or technology. It is about where good ideas come from. Was a corporal mechanic. He had no military academy education, no training in tactical doctrine, no credentials that anyone the chain of command would have recognized as qualifying him to comment on armored warfare strategy. He was, by every institutional measure, the last person who should have been contributing to how a regiment fought Tiger tanks. And yet his observations were right, not because he was a genius, because he was a mechanic. He looked at the Tiger the way he looked at it with a bad transmission. He didn't see a legendary superweapon, he saw a machine, and every machine has specs, tolerances, failure modes, and breaking points. The experts in the room, the West Point graduates, the career officers, they saw doctrine and history and strategy, saw a machine with a turret that took 60 seconds to rotate and an engine that drank fuel like a man dying of thirst. This pattern repeats across every war and every era of innovation. The people closest to the problem often see solutions that the experts miss, because experts are trained to see problems through the lens of existing doctrine, and doctrine is just yesterday's innovation hardened into dogma. British sailor who figured out that citrus fruit prevented scurvy was ignored for decades by naval surgeons. Who knew better? The Wright brothers were bicycle mechanics who were told by the most credentialed physicists of their era that powered flight was impossible. Spencer, the engineer who invented the microwave oven, had no college degree. He noticed that a candy bar in his pocket melted near a magnetron and asked why. In modern warfare, this lesson has become explicit policy. The U.S. military's Rapid Innovation Fund specifically solicits ideas from junior enlisted personnel and non-commissioned officers, the modern equivalents of the Israeli Defense Forces are famous for their flat command culture where a private can challenge a general's tactical decision in real time. These aren't just cultural preferences, they are institutional that the person closest to the problem, the mechanic under the tank, the driver behind the controls, sometimes sees what the general behind the map cannot. In the business world, the same principle drives every startup that disrupts an established industry. Founders of were design students, not hotel executives. The creators of were music fans, not record label presidents. Innovation doesn't come from credentials, it comes from proximity to the problem and the courage to say what you see, even when everyone with more rank and more experience tells you you're wrong. And there is one final detail about story that almost no one knows. In 1998, military historian named Dr. Robert was researching Third Army after action reports at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. He found something unexpected in a box of documents from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion. It was a single-page typewritten dated October 1944. It was a recommendation from Lieutenant Colonel to Third Army Intelligence proposing that the anti-Tiger tactical procedures developed during Operation Iron Hammer be formalized and attributed to their original source. His recommendation included a name not his own, not Captain Hayes, not Colonel. The name on the document was Corporal Edward J., U.S. Army, and the document recommended that the tactical bulletin be officially designated the protocols. The recommendation was Third Army. Staff decided that attributing tactical doctrine to an enlisted mechanic would undermine the authority of commissioned officers. The bulletin was published anonymously as Technical Bulletin 4417. His name appeared nowhere in it. The most influential piece of anti-tactical guidance produced by the American military in World War II was written by a corporal from Cleveland, and for over 50 years nobody outside his regiment knew it. Dr. Trackdown's family had died in 1991 at the age of 70 in the same house on East 71st Street where his mother had received that letter in November 1944, had died 2 years before him. His children, 2 daughters and a son, had no idea about the document. They knew their father had served in Third Army. They knew about the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart. They knew he never talked about the war. They did not know that their father's observations had helped reshape how the United States military fights armored battles to this day. In 2003, the Association of the United States Army published Dr. S. research. For the first time, the name Edward was publicly connected to the anti-Tiger tactics of September 1944. A small ceremony was held at the Army Heritage Center in Pennsylvania. Son Thomas accepted a commendation on behalf of his father. Thomas later told a reporter that his father would have been embarrassed by the attention. Dad always said he was just a mechanic who got lucky. Thomas said he never thought he did anything special. He just looked at the Tiger and saw what was broken. From a mechanic with an oil stained notebook to a tactical revolution that influenced 80 years of armored warfare across 40 nations. Proved that the most dangerous weapon in any army is not the biggest tank or the most powerful gun. It is the person who looks at an impossible problem and sees it differently than everyone else. 92 Tiger tanks were sent to stop. Fewer than 5 survived, not because the Sherman was better, not because the Americans had more money or more factories, though they did. They were destroyed because a mechanic who had never read a tactical manual understood something that generals with decades of experience had missed. Every machine breaks, every weapon has limits, and the side that finds those limits first wins. The war fixed, and then he fixed how America fights. He never knew the full extent of what he accomplished, and that might be the most important lesson of all. People who change history rarely know they're doing it. They're just solving the problem in front of them with whatever tools they have, the best way they know how. If you know a story like A person who saw something nobody else saw and changed everything. Share it in the comments. History is full of mechanics and farmers and teachers who did impossible things because nobody told them it was impossible in time. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because the greatest stories from the Second World War aren't about generals and presidents. They're about the people whose names were almost lost. The people who won the war. One observation, one notebook, one crazy idea at a time. The Tigers are gone, the Shermans are in museums, but somewhere right now there's another mechanic looking at an impossible problem and seeing what everyone else has missed. That's how wars are won, that's how the world changes, and that is why this story was worth telling.